Chapter 16. The town, such as it was called Rio Sucio. It had taken Schaefer some time to get there. On the flight from New York to Panama City, he had worked out a course of action, from what he remembered of what Dutch had said and his own knowledge of how the drug trade operated in Central America. He couldn't be sure there was any connection between Dutch and the drug runners, but it was the way he was betting it, at least for the moment. First stop was an old friend from Special Forces who got himself a job in the DEA. Schaefer had stayed in touch, since it's always useful for a cop working narco to have contacts in the DEA. That was a good way to pick up information that he might miss otherwise. It wasn't information Schaefer was after this time, though. It was weapons. He'd seen that thing in the tenement. He'd felt its fist. He'd heard Dutch talk about how unstoppable his theoretical superhuman would be, and Schaefer didn't doubt that the killer he was up against was the same one. He wasn't about to tackle it bare-handed. He wasn't even planning to take it on with ordinary armaments, if he could help it. He wanted something with real stopping power, something that would take down anything he ran up against, including an 8-foot monster. A Vulcan Gatling gun would have been about right, Schaefer thought, but Hansen, his friend at the DEA, couldn't get him one of those on short notice. He did all right, though, and not just with weapons. Hansen was able to get Schaefer enough cash, both dollars and the local stuff, to cover up whatever expenses might come up. Of course, he put it all on Schaefer's credit cards, but Schaefer had no complaints about the money or the ordnance. He owed Hansen a big favour now. Once he was armed, he had to figure out where to go and how to get there. He was doing all of this because he wanted to know more about what he was up against. Dutch had fought it somewhere and had gotten away alive. He'd lost all his men, and maybe the son of a bitch had caught him later. Maybe Dutch had been skinned and hung upside down somewhere eventually, but he had gotten out alive, once. Maybe he'd left some clues about how he'd managed it. Maybe they were still there, even after 8 years, and maybe Schaefer could learn enough from them to ensure that he'd survived too, and maybe even take the bastard down, once and for all. First though, Schaefer had to find where it had all gone down. Dutch hadn't given him a map, but he'd talked about his rescue mission, and Schaefer could remember damn near every word. Dutch had talked about coptering in over the Pacific, then going up over a ridge and across a border, then heading northeast down to a valley to make pickup. Schaefer had put that together with whatever other information he could come up with, had brought himself a ride north out of Panama, and followed his conclusions as far as he could, into the backcountry, to where the roads ended, and there was only jungle. And that had eventually brought him to Rio Sucio, where his last ride had refused to go any further, no matter what Schaefer paid. Schaefer had shrugged and put out word of what he wanted through all the local channels. He'd settled in, and made a table in the local saloon his headquarters. It had all taken time when that thing might be killing innocent people back in New York, but Schaefer had to live with that. He didn't see any other way to get at the thing, and besides, it gave him time to heal up. He didn't much care to go into the rematch with his ribs still aching, or his jaw still sore. Rio Sucio was little more than a clearing in the jungle, where a dozen huts, built in the traditional palapa style, were gathered. The polite liberals back in the Big Apple would call the green hell a rainforest if they wanted, but as far as Schaefer was concerned, and as far as the locals were concerned, it was jungle, sweltering hot and thoroughly hostile, and it was all around. The saloon where Schaefer made himself at home was the showplace of Rio Sucio. It had a floor of smooth black dirt with good drainage and nothing growing on it, and the roof was tin over planking, rather than thatch. It didn't leak enough to water the drinks, which Schaefer considered a plus, since the bartender watered them down enough to begin with. The windows had shutters but no glass, which didn't really matter, since the screen door had holes big enough to let in buzzards, and even the biggest of the mutant mosquitoes in the jungle outside could fit through if they tried. There were no ceiling fans, no electric lights, and the idea of air conditioning was the wildest of fantasies here. The air felt as hot and thick as soup, and the inside of the saloon was no different in that regard from the jungle outside. The lessened air circulation was roughly balanced by the greatly reduced sunlight. Far more important than any of this, from Schaefer's point of view, was the fact that Rio Sucio was built at the foot of the ridge that marked the border between this particular stretch of malarial rainforest claiming to be a nation and the next, equally backward chunk of jungle. As the real estate folks said, location, location, location. Rio Sucio might not have much, but as far as Schaefer was concerned, it had the right location. Dutch had gone over that ridge, Schaefer was sure. Dutch had said that his rescue mission was hush-hush stuff because of the risk of starting a war, and at the time, this particular pair of banana republics had been closest to escalating their perpetual disagreements and border incidents into something bloodier and more formal. They weren't anymore, and as Schaefer sat at his chosen table, he wondered whether Dutch had had anything to do with this inexplicable bout of reasonableness, or whether it had just been one small part of the general political shifts of the last decade. "Otra cerveza, señor?" the bartender said. "Si," Schaefer replied, looking up. "And don't spit in it this time." He had no idea whether the bartender understood the English. Around here, Spanish was usually a second or third language, after the local Indio dialect and maybe Maya, and English was a long shot at best. He noticed a shadow on the screen and turned to face the door. A man in green fatigues, tired tread sandals and a wide-brimmed green hat stepped in, tall by local standards and bearded. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, while the bartender delivered Schaefer's beer. Schaefer paid for the bottle without ever letting his attention leave the newcomer, and left the beer sitting untouched on the table. The man in fatigues had no visible weapons anywhere, but that looked somehow unnatural. He was plainly a man who ought to be armed. He spotted Schaefer quickly enough. There weren't many men in this place. And of those few, there was only one of Schaefer's size and with blonde hair. Even in the dimness, Schaefer was very obviously a Norteamericano. The stranger crossed the room to Schaefer's table and looked down at him. "I understand you're looking for a guide," he said, in clear but accented English. "Word travels fast," Schaefer replied, finally picking up the beer and taking a swig. "Sit down." The man sat. "I'm told you're a policeman from New York," he said after a moment. "Did you have many enemies among the La Costa de Medellin, the Cali?" "You have a problem with that?" Schaefer asked. "No," the guide said with a toothy smile. "It just means I charge more." Schaefer shrugged. "It shouldn't matter anyway. I'm not interested in drugs this time. I'm looking for some Norte-Americanos who disappeared over the border 8 years back." "8 years?" the guide said. Schaefer nodded. "That's right. 8 years is a long time, senor." Schaefer shrugged. "I've been busy. Didn't get around to it till now." "These men, they were all men, no women?" "The Norte-Americanos, see, all men, 6 of them." Dutch's squad had been 6 men, and 5 of them had died somewhere in this goddamn steam bath. "The way you say that," the guide asked. "Were there others? You say you are looking for these 6? "There may have been others, but that's who I'm looking for," Schaefer agreed. "Them, and something else, something that comes with the heat." The guide considered him thoughtfully. "And who would this be, this thing that comes with the heat?" the guide asked. "A man?" "I don't know," Schaefer said. "That's what I want to find out." "Ah," the guide said, smiling. "I see. You're mad. Mr. New York policeman. Which means I charge even more." Schaefer smiled back. "I think we're going to get along fine," he said.